In this video, we're just going to introduce the concept of elasticity. Elasticity is defined to be a measure of how responsive one variable is to a change in another variable. Typically, we're looking at how responsive quantity demanded or quantity supplied is when some other variable changes. One of the most commonly used measures of elasticity is price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand is a measure of how sensitive quantity demanded is to a change in the price of that good. And we classify elasticity as being either elastic or inelastic. And we say that demand is elastic when quantity demanded is relatively sensitive to the price of the good. We say that demand is inelastic when quantity demanded is relatively insensitive to the price. We'll define that more precisely in the next video in this series. We can, though, talk a little bit about what makes demand more or less elastic. In particular, we have to think about what things will cause consumers to be more sensitive to the price of a particular good. One factor is when there's a lot of close substitutes. If the price of a particular brand of breakfast cereal goes up, it's likely that demand would be relatively elastic because there are many close substitutes for that. Similarly, if the price of a given brand of soda or sports beverage goes up, people have many other close substitutes for that, so they'll respond by cutting back their consumption quite a bit. On the other hand, for goods where there are no close substitutes, such as insulin, we'd expect demand to be relatively inelastic because if the price goes up, consumers don't really have many good alternatives to that. Demand also tends to be more elastic for luxury goods rather than necessities. Luxuries are goods that you have some choice over buying, while necessities are things you pretty much need no matter what the price is. So we'd expect demand to be much more sensitive to the price for goods that are luxuries. And we'll define luxuries more precisely again in a later video. But for now, I think we can just rely on our general intuitive understanding of this. So if the price of food goes up, you're probably not going to cut back on eating because food is a necessity. On the other hand, if airfare goes up and it becomes more expensive to take a vacation, because that's more likely to be a luxury, people are more likely to cut back on vacation travel when vacation travel becomes more expensive. So in general, luxuries tend to be much more sensitive to the price than necessities. Another factor that's important is how large a share of your budget is spent on a good. If you're spending a large share of your budget on a good, when the price goes up, you're forced to cut back by more. If you're spending half of your income on a good and the price doubles, you'd only be able to buy the same amount if you spent all of your income on that good. So when something's a large share of your budget, you have to be more sensitive to price changes. On the other hand, if something accounts for a trivial share of your budget, a price change probably won't have much of an effect on the amount that you consume. A classic example that economists always use to illustrate this effect is the price of salt. Think about the price of a cylinder of salt. Unless you regularly go out and buy salt, you may not even know exactly how much that costs, in large part because people only buy those occasionally, and it's a fairly small share of the total grocery budget. If the price of salt were to double, it's still going to be a pretty trivial share of your total budget, and the cost per day tends to be just a fraction of a cent. So price changes there, because they have such a small effect on the purchasing power of your income, are unlikely to have much of an effect on the quantity of the good that you buy. In general, demand tends to be more elastic in the long run than in the short run because we tend to be creatures of habit. We tend to keep spending our money and spending our time in similar ways, and it takes time to adapt to change. Similarly, there are some changes that take longer to implement. For example, if the price of heating your home goes up, in the short run, you might be able to turn down the temperature, but in the long run, you might be able to put in better insulation in your home. You might be able to install a new furnace or a new heating system. You might be able to put in new windows or more energy efficient windows and doors. But all those changes take time. Similarly, if the price of gasoline goes up, in the short run, you might drive a little bit less. In the long run, you might end up buying a more fuel-efficient car or move closer to work or switch to some other form of transportation which is less expensive. In the short run, though, there's not much you can do to change your pattern in terms of how often you need to drive to work, to school, or to other places. But in the long run, you have more flexibility. So in general, demand tends to be much more elastic in the long run than in the short run. Another thing that's discussed in your reading is that demand tends to be more elastic when there's multiple sellers, or alternatively, demand tends to be much less elastic if there's only, at the extreme, one seller. The reason for that, though, ultimately comes down to that first point here, that demand is more elastic when there's close substitutes that you can switch to. If there's only one company selling it, there are not very many close substitutes, and as a result, it's harder for you to replace a good if it's a good that's important to you. So, ceteris paribus, holding other things equal, when there's more sellers for a good, there are more close substitutes, and that's why demand tends to be more elastic in that case.